All right, I will say good morning, a good tevach. Hopefully everyone had a beautiful Shabbos, beautiful beginning to our week. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. Mrs. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi Zichron Libracha. To thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in the Schusar of Hur Shalima for Shulamis Bas Susha. We hope that the Neshama will have an Aliyah, the family in Nechama, and the Chola should have a refuah together with Kol Chole Yisrael. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Dr. Mark and Elsa Lustman, in honor of the Archikala, and for refuah shalema for all of the Cholim in our community. Meretz Hashem. Trip should be successful, and again, Kol Chole Yisrael should have a complete and enduring refuah. Now, let's say with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Yud Gimel 13, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem at the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Beis, the bottom of 12b. Literally, again, 4 lines up from the bottom. Says the Mishnah, Harini Nazir, L'chishiyeli Ben. Interesting case. So we'll say, so what happens? A person says, I will be a Nazir when I have a son. So again, what he's doing is he's linking his Neder Nazirus to the birth of his child. So fine. So what's Talacham? V'nolad lo ben, and then he has a son. Hari's a Nazir. He's a Nazir. Okay. Pretty straightforward case. Next case, Nolad lo bas. What happens again if his wife gives birth to a daughter? Or tumtum va'androgynous. It's been a while since they've been at the party, right? So tumtum and androgynous, right? So again, remember, so tumtum again, there's a membrane covering again the sexual organs. So we're not sure about the gender. Or androgynous, male and female qualities. Ain't no nazir. In that case, we'll say he's not a nazir. He's not a nazir. Fine. Vlad. So also, however, if a person says, I will become a Nazir when I have a Vlad, how would you translate Vlad? Offspring, a child. A child. What's the halacha? Filu nolad lo bas tumtum v'androgynous hareze Nazir. Then again, irrespective of the gender of the child, ultimately the Neder Nazirus is triggered. Top of Yud Gimel. Here's an interesting case. Hepila ishto. Now, here's what I want to point out, something very interesting. Hipila Ishto literally means his wife miscarried. Now, understand, when we think about a miscarriage, Rahman al-Itzlan, so we think about, again, a woman is somewhere in the duration of pregnancy, right? And she lost the pregnancy, chas v'shalom. Just to explain, in this context, Hipila Ishto means the wife gave birth to a baby. The baby didn't survive. So now, what's the shaila? If you take a look at the top Rashi says over here, Hepila ishto. Let me read the phrase. The phrase is Hepila ishto eino nazir. If his wife gives birth to a baby, but then the baby dies, chas v'shalom, he's not a nazir. Now, what's the pshat? Take a look at Rashi. Hepila ishto eino nazir. The dilma hay de hepila lo hava ben kayoma shelo kalu lo chadashav velo vlad havi v'safek nizir zakavos. Listen to this. And this is actually an interesting concept that comes up in a couple of areas in halacha. A woman goes in and gives birth, and the baby shortly after birth passes away. The shaila in halacha is, was that considered to be a viable child or not? So in this context, a man's making a neder, and he says, again, let's just go with the last case. His case says, Kishiyi Vlad, when I have a child, I will be a nazir. Now, again, we understand that when a person says, when I have a child, I'm going to be a Nazir, what type of child is he referring to? A viable child. So therefore, again, the shaila is that when the child passes away so soon after birth, so halacha l'maisa, is that called a viable child or not? That's the fundamental shaila. Also, I point out another area in halacha where this comes up is, again, Rahman al-Islam, is in Hilchos Avelos. Right? A couple has a child. The child passes away within a relatively short amount of time. So do parents have an obligation of mourning, of shiva, of kaddish for a child who passes away within a short amount of time? So interestingly enough, when it comes to halachos of avelos, the mark often is a 30-day mark. If the baby survives for up to 30 days, that's called a viable child. And then halacha l'maisa, again, hilchos avelos kicking in. However, there are some very interesting shilas in halacha where again you have children who are again, Rahman al born with certain conditions, which we know the child will not survive. And maybe even if the child makes it past the 30-day mark, it's clear that this unfortunately is not a viable child. So I'm pointing out just interesting halachos and avelos. In any event, but back to Naziros. So what happens now? We'll call the guy Ruvain. Ruvain said, Kishi livlad eya Nazir. When I have a child, right? When I have a child, I will be a Nazir. Wife gives birth, baby passes away relatively shortly. So what's the halacha? Ain't no Nazir. He's not a Nazir. Why? Now, why isn't he a Nazir? Because Rashi says there's a suffix about whether or not this child was viable. So we'll say there's a klal by Naziros, which apparently we're just being introduced to now. Suffix Naziros lahakel. Whenever you have a doubt in Naziros, we always resolve that doubt leniently. So therefore, again, in this case, this guy's a suffix Naziros. Therefore, suffix Naziros lahakel. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi Shimon says, Yomar, a person should say as follows. Im haya ben kayama hareani nazir. So we'll say, Rabbi Shimon says, we have to deal with the doubt a little bit differently. Person should say as follows. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yomar, im haya ben kayama, if my child was a viable child, nazir chova. I am fulfilling my obligatory nazir nazirus. Vim lav, but if the child was not a bar kayama, was not a viable child, then hare ani nazir nidava. Then ultimately, I'm going to say, what am I? I'm a nazir nidava. And I'm going to say, what's a nazir nidava? Just a voluntary nazir, which, by the way, almost all cases of Nazirus are a Nazir Nidava. Nazir Nidava is just another way of saying a regular Nazir, as opposed to these cases where a person is tying their Neder Nazirus to be triggered by a particular event. So Rabbi Shimon says essentially, cover your bases. So Tanna Kama says, if the baby passes away soon after birth, you're not a Nazir. Why? Because it's a suffix whether or not the child is viable. Suffix Nazirus lahakel. Rabbi Shimon seems to hold that Rabbi Shimon holds suffix Nazirus lahachmir, l'chumra. And therefore Rabbi Shimon will say like this, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Shimon will say that essentially take on the Neder Nazirus, but with a Tanai. If I'm obligated in the Neder Nazirus, I should fulfill my obligation. And if I'm not obligated, then what am I doing? I'm just a Nazir. Incredible. Chazra v'yalda. So I'll say, so now this is actually an interesting case. Let's say now the wife goes ahead and now gives birth. So we'll say, so she had the baby didn't survive, and then sometime later on, she gives birth to another child. So we'll say, so here's the interesting question. Now remember, hovering over this guy is still what? The statement that he made that if I have a child, I will become a Nazir. So watch this. Chazra v'yalda hareze Nazir. So we'll say, this is fascinating. So look, this is where the Tanna Kama is going to see. So remember, we have two opinions happening over here. Let's just frame the case. Case is, Ruvain says, when I have a child, I will be a Nazir. His wife gives birth, baby doesn't survive. Tanna Kama says, you're not a Nazir. Suffix whether or not that child was a viable child. Suffix Nazirus lahakel, and therefore you're not a Nazir. Reb Shimon, it's a suffix. He holds suffix Nazirus l'chumra. Therefore, you are a Nazir, but you should count your Neder Nazirus in the following way. If I'm obligated to be a Nazir, then this is my obligation. If I'm not obligated to be a Nazir, then this is my voluntary Nazirus. Good. Fast forward. Then Ruvain's wife does give birth, Baruch Hashem, to a healthy, viable child. According to the Tanna Kama, the neder he made is now triggered. Right now, the neder is triggered because he made a neder that when my wife has a baby, I'm going to go ahead and become a Nazir. Now, Baruch Hashem, she has a baby. Now he is a Nazir. Chazra v'yalda harei Nazir. Rabbi Shimon says, Yomar. And Rabbi say, what's the problem with Rabbi Shimon? See, the problem with Rabbi Shimon is Ruvain has already observed a Neder Naziros after the first baby passed away. So according to Rabbi Shimon, what should he do? Watch this. Yomar, he should make it tonight. He should observe another Neder Naziros, but he should make it tonight. Yomar, im harishon ben kayama, if my first child was indeed a viable child, harishon chova v'zuna dava, then the first duration of Naziros should be the obligatory one, and this should be the optional one. Ve'im lav, and if not, in other words, if the first child was not viable, and this child is, Harishon Dava V'Zuchova. So we'll say, so actually, it's incredibly fascinating. So we'll say, so therefore, so what you have over here, according to Rabbi Shimon, is you're going to end up observing 2 periods of Nazirus. So which makes sense, because in Rabbi Shimon's world, Safek Nazirus is L'chumra. So when that first baby passed away, and we're not sure, was that a viable child, not a viable child, Rabbi Shimon's going to say, L'chumra, therefore you're going to have to observe a period of Nazir Nazirus. So we'll say, a fascinating machlokes, which is really anchored in a core concept of Safek Nazirus L'kula or Safek Nazirus L'chumra. How do we paskin, or how do we resolve a doubtful situation of Nazirus, L'chumra u L'kula, Tanakama L'kula, Rabbi Shimon L'chumra. Incredible. So now let's go through the case of the Mishnah. So remember, how did the Mishnah begin? The Mishnah began with a statement, which is, a man says, if I have a son, I will be a Nazir. Okay, then what did the Mishnah say? If his wife gives birth to a son, he's a Nazir. To which the Gemara says, okay, Hai Mai Lemimra. Supposed to say, what? Fine, like what's the chiddush in this? To which the Gemara said, Mishum Seifa, Mishum Seifa, Bas Tumtum Va'androgynous Eino Nazir. Supposed to say, no. It's really for the Seifa. It's for the Seifa, because the Seifa teaches me that if his wife gives birth to a daughter, a tumtum and an androgynous, he's not a Nazir. To which the Gemara says, again, Pshita. They both say, isn't that obvious? In other words, what is the guy saying? What is Ruvain saying? Right? When I have a son, I will be a Nazir. So I need to teach you all this. Well, this is actually very interesting. They both say, maybe when Ruvain says, when I have a Ben doesn't have to mean son. Rather, what does Ben mean? Someone who will build me up, which means a child. And maybe it means any child. Kamash Malondolo. Kamash Malondolo will say no, that when Ruvain says, when I have a son, I will be a Nazir. What does son mean? What does Ben mean? What does Ben mean? A son. It means a son. And therefore the Neder Nazirus is only triggered with a son. Okay, next case. Amar Kishiyeli Vlad. So we'll say, remember again, interestingly enough, that next case was, a man says, if I have a child. So in that case, whether he has a son, daughter, tumtum, androgynous, the neder is going to be triggered. To which the Gemara says, Pshita. So we'll say, that's obvious, right? So what's the chiddush? This is actually very interesting. Ma'ad Vlad demichshiv bene inshi ba'inan. Perhaps I will say, when he said this, what was he referring to? He was talking about offspring that people consider to be important. What's the offspring that people consider to be important? Rashi says, Vlad demichshiv bene inshi kamina tahainu ben. Maybe it means a son. Visulo. So we'll say, so in other words, listen to the words of the Gemara and let's explain what the Gemara is saying. A guy says, when I have a child, I will become a Nazir. So the Mishnah says, okay, child is non-gender specific. Therefore, a son, a daughter, a tumtum, an androgynous, you are a Nazir. You are a Nazir. So the Gemara says, what's the chiddush? The chiddush is, the Gemara says, maybe Vlad also means what? Maybe Vlad also means a son. What does Vlad mean? Vlad means an offspring which is important in the eyes of people. What's an example of offspring that's important in the eyes of people? A son. A son and not a daughter. And I will say, we see lines like this, and people often interpret this, that you see that Chazal are misogynistic. Chazal, right, only place an importance. So we'll say, it's important to look exactly what the words of the Gemara are saying. This is not Chazal making a statement. This is Chazal echoing what often society thinks. So I will say, so again, in society, again, it's different now. But let me say, historically, there was always a greater level of importance placed on sons than there were on daughters, right? For a variety of different reasons. So I just want to point out, this is not Chazal saying that sons are more important than daughters. I can tell you the simple reason that there are so many other ma'amari Chazal, statements of Chazal, that highlight the beauty, the importance, the centrality of daughters in a mishpacha, of women in Klal Yisrael. Right? So I say, what do you do with the statement that says, "B'shel noshim tzidkanios nigalu avsim Mitzrayim"? This is Gemara Masechah Sota. We're going to see it right next Masechta. It was because of righteous Jewish women that Klal Yisrael were redeemed from Egypt. So again, and there are so many other statements like this extolling the power, the virtue, the importance of the Jewish woman within the framework of Klal Yisrael. So just when you see a statement like this is not an opinion being expressed in Chazal. You can even see the Lashon. He says, Vlad de Michshav Bene Inchi. Bene Inchi is the way people talk, the way people think. Okay, so in society, it was common for people to think, a son carries your name, an inheritor, this, that, a daughter. So therefore, again, you might remember, so much of Nedarim is determined by how people speak, by how people think, by how society acts. So the Havamina is, you might have thought that halacha l'maisa, when he says Vlad, maybe Vlad also means a son. Kamash Malon, no. Kamash Malon is that Vlad means any child. It's also an incredible Musar Haskell. How careful we have to be, because sometimes society thinks in a lot of ways. And sometimes what society thinks is good, and sometimes what society thinks is not good. And how careful we have to be to make sure that our hashkafas, our mindsets, our outlooks, our beliefs, our ideals, our beliefs are concretized by Torah and concretized by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and not driven by whatever is the contemporary popular agenda. And by the way, it was true even then. It was true even then. This is not a new phenomenon that society espouses ideas or isms or ideologies that are totally contrary to what we believe to be MS. It's an age-old issue, and it's part of the greatest challenge of being a Jew in contemporary. There's an easy way to deal with it. What's the easy way to deal with it? Shutter yourself off from everything. That's the easiest that's the easiest thing to do. Say, I have nothing to do with the world. That's easy, but that's not our job. Our job is to exist as from Torah Jews within contemporary society, to influence society, to have an impact on society, to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim. But the challenge of that is being strong in your beliefs, maintaining your beliefs, while ultimately, again, having a positive impact all around you, while not letting that which is around you have an impact on you. In any event, all from Maseches Nazir, because it says the Gemara Vayter, Hipila Ishto Eno Nazir. So also I say, interesting, if his wife miscarried. Now again, remember, when I say miscarry, it's not the typical miscarriage. She's giving birth and then the baby died. So he's not a Nazir, it's Tanakama. So Man Katanila, so I will say, who ultimately is the author of this statement in the Mishnah? Rabbi Huda decrees, Rabbi Huda of the pile. I will say, what's Rabbi Huda of the pile? So we had this on Dat Ches. So remember again, I will say, so a person said, I'm a Nazir on the condition that there is 100 core in this pile. I'm just quoting Rashi, right? And then what happens? He gets to the pile was stolen. The pile was stolen. So he never knows. What? He never knows. Oh, Avron Elbaum is joining us from Eretz Yisrael. Incredible, Avron. Are you in the Aroma Cafe, or is that just an Aroma Coffee? Mamish, okay, incredible. It's like a commercial over here. It's product placement. We had incredible. He'll say so incredible. He'll say so the Maisa again. So Rabbi Huda says you're not a Nazir. Rabbi says not a Nazir. Now remember, what's the issue? The issue is you linked your Neder Nazirus ultimately to the pile having 100 core. Now what happened? The pile's gone. So what don't you know? You don't know if the pile has 100 core or not. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Huda holds that you're not a Nazir. Why? Safek Naziros lahakel. Incredible. So we'll say, so therefore again, Rabbi Huda is the opinion on Mishnah of Safek Naziros lahakel. Good. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yomarim Haya Ben Kaya, Maharini Nazir Chova, Vim Lafarin Nazir Dava. So we'll say, so remember again, comes on Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds Safek Naziros l'chumra. Therefore, again, what does Rabbi Shimon say? So remember, Ruvain said, when I have a child, I'm going to be a Nazir. Ruvain's wife gives birth. Unfortunately, the baby passes away shortly afterwards. So what does Rabbi Shimon say? What should you do? Go ahead and you're a Nazir. But what do you do? You're a Nazir with a Tanai. If the baby was a viable baby, then this is an obligatory Nazirus. And if the baby Chashon wasn't a viable baby, then this is a voluntary Nazirus. Okay, so it says the Gemara, Ba'minei Rabbi Amma Merav Huna. So we'll say this is an interesting case. Harini Nazir l'chshieli ben. So listen to this. Ruvain says, I'll become a Nazir. Ultimately, again, when I have a son. when I have a son. So Rabbi says, so then what happens? Vehepila ishto vehefish karbon. And ultimately, again, then what happens? His wife miscarries, and so I'll say, so again, and he separated out his karbanos. So in this case over here, what ended up happening was he made his neder nazirus, right? He went ahead and even separated out the karbanos he's going to bring at the end of his neder nazirus. Wife gives birth, baby doesn't survive. Baby doesn't survive. Okay. V'chazra v'yaldo. And now ultimately again, she goes ahead and she gives birth again. She gives birth again. Mahu. So we'll say, what's the halacha here? What's the halacha here? So the Gemara says, Ali b'deman. So we'll say, so I'll point out over here, this is very interesting. So the Rush has a girsha in this where she was carrying twins. It could be either right where she's carrying twins. He didn't know she was carrying twins. So the first baby comes out, baby passes away shortly afterwards, and then some amount of time later, the twin comes out. But it could also just as easily be another case where she gives birth sometime later on. So Mao, so I'll say, so what is the halacha? So what is the halacha? So the Gemara says, Miyavi Kadosh, fine. So Mao, Aliba Deman. So we'll say, whose opinion are we asking according to? Aliba Rabbi Shimon. If you're asking according to Rabbi Shimon, Mighty Baile. So we'll say, what's the shaila? According to Rabbi Shimon, Ha'amr Rabbi Shimon Safek Naziros Lahachmir. Rabbi Shimon already said that a Safek Naziros you're going to be machmir. So what's the shaila? Ve'ela Alibad Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, must be according to Rabbi Yehuda. Let's remember again, Rabbi Yehuda, we've identified, is the opinion in the Tanakama. Right? Rabbi Yehuda is the opinion who holds that halacha lamaisa Safek Naziros is lahakel. So the Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Safek Naziros lahakel. My kadosh. Oh, lo kadosh. Ultimately, again, are the animals consecrated or not? That's the shaila. So the Gemara says, again, my nafkamina. What does it matter if the animals are kadosh or not kadosh? Very simple. Ligizaso v'la'avodbo. Can you shear the animals and can you use them for work? That's the nafkamina. To which the Gemara says, teku. Okay, so we'll say teku. So again, remember, it's not a teku in Rabbi Shimon, it's only teku in Rabbi Yehuda. Good. Ba'minei ben Rachume me'abaye. Supposed to listen to this. This guy ben Rachume. I will say, what a name. Ben Rachume, right? The son, obviously his son was Rachume, but I'm just saying, or it could also be descriptive, the son of Rachume, the son of Rachamim. Halavai, we should all be a Ben Rachume, right? The type of person that has compassion, the type of person that has empathy, the type of person that cares. So now it's a great, from now on, the greatest compliment, you want to give somebody a compliment, you say, you know what? You are a Ben Rachume, right? They might think you're saying something nasty, right? But Lamaisa, again, so beautiful. Ben Rachume. So Ben Rachume me'abaye. Here's the case. Harini Nazir lichashiehe li ben. Okay, so we'll say, watch the case. Ruvain says, I'm going to be a Nazir when I have a son. Fine. V'shama chavero, Shimon hears this, and he says, va'amar va'alai, and upon me. So, right? So we'll say, so what does this sound like is happening over here? Ruvain makes a neder, when I have a son, I'm going to be a Nazir. And what does Shimon say? Va'alai. I take it upon me as well. So we'll say, now what's the shaila? Mahu. What is Shimon saying? Adibure mashma? Is Shimon saying, Ruvain, I also take it upon myself that when you, Ruvain, have a son, I'm also going to become a Nazir? Or agufei mashma? Is Shimon saying, when I, Shimon, have a son, I'm also going to be a Nazir? We'll say, you hear what's going on over here? So Ruvain's saying again, one more time. Ruvain says, when I have a son, I'm going to be a Nazir. And Shimon says, va'alai, I take upon me. So the shaila is, what is he taking upon himself? Is he taking upon himself as a adibure? Is he latching on to the statement of Ruvain, meaning that Ruvain, I also agree that when you Ruvain have a son, I'm also going to be a Nazir, like to celebrate with you. We're going to be Nazirim together. It's a terrible celebration, right? I'm saying like it's going to be a pretty dry celebration, right? But lamaisa, right? I'm with you. Or is he taking on like a parallel neder? When I have a son, Shimon, I will also become a Nazir. So that's the shaila. And if you say ultimately again that what Shimon is doing is taking on his own neder nazirus, linked to the birth of his own son, Amar Hareini Nazir. Listen to this. What happens if Reuven says as follows? Amar Hareini Nazir l'chishei li ben v'shama chavero. And I will say now what happens? Same case. Reuven says, I'm going to become a Nazir when I have a son. Shimon hears this and he says, Va'ani, me too. Now I will say, what's the difference in this case and the last case? The first case was Va'alai. I'm taking upon me. right? So now in case number 2, we're saying va'ani, me too. So now we're asking, is there a distinction between upon me and me too? The Gemara says, Ma'u, anafshe ka'amar, is ultimately, again, a Shimon taking upon a parallel neder upon himself, namely that when he has a son, ultimately, again, he's going to become a Nazir. Aldima ka'amar, rachamina likavasech. Or I will say, maybe, this is so beautiful, maybe what Shimon is saying to Ruvain is, I love you like I love myself. And therefore, va'ani, when you have a son, it's going to be as if I have a son. And therefore, I take on this neder naziros for myself. Rachmana lach kavasech. Rachimna, I love you like I love myself. I love you like I love myself. So first of all, just understand this beautiful Havamina in the Gemara about what it means to really love another person. And what it means to love another person is their accomplishments become your accomplishments. I will say I think we most relate to this in the realm of children, right? Because often in the realm of children, when your child accomplishes something, you feel that as your own. Hopefully we have that in a marriage as well, right? That a spouse's accomplishment is the same as my own accomplishment. It is my accomplishment. But I will say, so it's so beautiful over here when he says va'ani. So what is he saying? That Ruvain. So does va'ani mean that Shimon's taking on his own neder naziros when Shimon has a son? Or is he saying, Ruvain, I love you so much like I love myself, that the birth of your son is like the birth of my son? Imtim salomar, so even if you want to go with the approach of kol ba'an pei, amid beis, keseifa li milsa, so I'll say, so now listen to this. Maybe, let's say you go with the idea that Shimon has such empathy and such love for Ruvain because he's in the presence of Ruvain. So in other words, Ruvain's saying, when I have a son, I'm going to be a Nazir. Shimon says, I love you like I love myself. Therefore, what? I'm going to also become a Nazir when you, Ruvain, have a son. But I will say, what triggers Shimon's empathic response is what? The fact that he's in the presence of Ruvain. So what about the following case? Amar Hareini Nazir, l'chashei leploni ben. Right? In this case, right? Ruvain says, I'm going to be a Nazir when Levi has a son. So watch this, right? So now we're shifting it off Ruvain, right? So Ruvain says, I'm going to become a Nazir when Levi has a son. V'shama chavero, Shimon standing right next to Ruvain. Va'amar va'ani. And Shimon says, me too. So now, what's that? Shabbos say, va'amar va'ani. Mahu. Mi amrinan shelo b'fanav b'anaf sheika amar. Shabbos say, so now, here's what's interesting. Ruvain is making a neder for someone else. That didn't come out right. In other words, Ruvain's making a neder for someone else's birth of a child. So Ruvain's saying, when Levi has a son, I'm going to be a Nazir. Now, Shimon hears Ruvain's statement, and Shimon says, Vani, me too. So Rabbi says, now what's the shaila? How do we interpret the me too of Shimon? Do we say, Shalom b'fanav, since ultimately, again, Ruvain's vow is being made about someone who's not in Shimon's presence, so maybe the empathy piece is not really there. And so when Shimon says Va'ani, what does Va'ani mean? I'm taking on my own neder, that's what? When I have a son, I'm also going to be a Nazir. Or maybe Shimon's saying, no, I love Levi like I love myself, and therefore he is linking his neder nazirus to the birth of Levi's kids. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Bottom line for all of these things? Tibai. Ultimately, and I will say the Gemara leaves it as a teku. So really quite fascinating. We'll say, now, why is it a teku? We'll say, why is it a teku? Because one of the hardest things to sometimes know in relationships is about how someone actually feels about you. So I will say, this is why this is a tibai. See here, you've got Levi, and Levi's saying I'm in. So is Levi saying I'm in because he wants something for himself? Is Levi saying I'm in because at the end of the day he loves Ruvain like he loves himself? You don't know. I'll say this is sometimes the hardest piece in relationships, right? In general, it's a hard piece in relationships because we'll say, we try not to do this, but as we get older and we get cynical, a little bit more sarcastic and jaded and upset and disappointed and disillusioned, and okay, that's enough. And I was like, so sometimes like when people do things, kind of like the reflexive reaction to when someone does something is like, what's your angle, right? What do you want, right? What do you want? That's why sometimes like when we see people who do things that are just good and altruistic and pure and selfless, there's a part of us that wonders like, come on, what are you getting out of it, right? What's in it for you? And I will say it's hard, and this is why sometimes it's hard for us to create meaningful and loving and fulfilling relationships, because we're never really sure about where the other is holding. I'm not necessarily willing to make myself fully vulnerable to someone else because there's a piece of me that doesn't trust, and maybe for good reason. It's because I've been hurt. It's because I've been taken advantage of in the past. So I'm not really willing to fully give myself over. And I'm just pointing out this lack of clarity which exists in every single relationship. You see it over, it's incredible. Relationships come from the Gemara, psychology comes from the Gemara, everything is here. But this here you have Shimon saying, Va'ani, I'm in, Va'alai, upon me. What is he saying? Is it because he loves me? Is it because he cares about me? Or is it because he's doing something for himself? And you see at the end of the day, Chazal can't figure, you can't know, only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows ultimately what exists in the heart of man. We'll say, I will just end off, so let's just close out the sugya. So what is the halacha? We'll say, so let's go back to the Mishnah, because in the Mishnah's case, we had essentially three different, right? The first couple of cases were obvious, right? And that's how the Rambam paskins. It's Parak Beis Hilchos Nazir Halacha Yud Zayin. Person says, I'm going to be a Nazir when I have a son. What's the halacha? If he has a son, he's a Nazir, right? But if he has a daughter, tumtum and androgynous, he's not the Nazir. Shabbos say, now listen to this. What happens? Let's go to the last case, right? The last case in the Mishnah, which was the Machlokes case, right? Reuven says, when I have a child, let's go with Vlad, right? When I have a child, and child is anything, son, daughter, tumtum, androgynous. So remember again, last case in the Mishnah, I have a son. When I have a child, I'm going to become a Nazir, and then what happens? Wife miscarries. Shabbos say, now again, and remember, we're defining miscarry as what? She delivered the baby. The baby didn't survive. And say, by the way, I also want to point out it's not a stillborn, because the stillborn also is considered, it would not trigger any of this. This has to be a baby that was alive for some amount of time. And then, again, it's tragic to speak about these things like in such cold legal terms, but then went ahead and passed away. So we'll say, so now where our problem is, our challenge is, was the child viable or not? And so namely, did the birth of that child trigger the Nazirus or not? So this is the Machlokes in the Mishnah, Tanakama, that we identified as Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda holds Safek Nazirus lahakel, therefore you're not a Nazir at all. Rabbi Shimon says Safek Nazirus l'chumra, and therefore Rabbi Shimon says, what do you have to do? You essentially have to become a Nazir with a Tanai. If the baby was viable, then I'm an obligatory Nazir. And if the baby wasn't viable, then what? Then I am a voluntary Nazir. So we'll say, how does the Rambam paskin? Here we go. Hepilo ishto, eino Nazir. We'll say the Rambam paskins like the Tanakama, like Rabbi Yehuda, Safek Nazirus lahakel, and therefore halacha lemaisa, at the end of the day, you are not a Nazir. Everyone, are you in the airport? He's in the airport. Mamish. Incredible. Wow. Okay. Beautiful. I knew I recognized the coffee shop there in Lobby Ben Gurion. Incredible. It's very expensive, by the way. Very expensive. All right. Yeah, he knows. Okay. Wow. So we'll say, that's what I point out. We'll say, where else do you find the people like this? I'm sure everyone is well rested, well fed. The airplane food is delicious. Right? It's the daf. This is the daf. And I also point out, by the way, and it's incredible, it's also what it means to be part of a shir. Right, there stays to all the Chevron Zoom, right? It means to be part of a shir, like you can learn the daf by yourself anytime. But there's no shortage of platforms of wonderful things. You can learn it anytime, any this, that. But there's something beautiful to when you're part of something that has a kvios. You're part of something that's set. You're part of a chevra. Incredible. Everyone, thank you. Started my morning with inspiration today. All right, both says Rama Paskins that Allah Chalamaisa, we pass like Tanakama. Therefore, again, if the woman miscarries, halacha l'maisa, again, he is not a Nazir. However, Rabosa, here it is, we're not finished. Chazra v'nis abra, however, again, Rabosa, if she becomes pregnant and then gives birth to a healthy baby later on, harei zen Nazir. So Rabosa, I just want to point out, see, Reuven made a neder. And what's his neder? When I have a child, I will be a Nazir. So now his wife, unfortunately, again, I'm using the word miscarried. Okay, so it didn't trigger the neder naziros. But I just want to point out, just because the baby passed away, the neder doesn't go away. The neder is still there. So at some point in the future, in Amirat Hashem, Ruvain has a viable child, the neder is triggered. It's fascinating. Fascinating. So that's why Pastor Mosai, like the Tanakama, like Rabbi Yehuda. That is the halacha l'maisa. Beautiful. Mishnah. Hareini Nazir. This is a very interesting case. A very interesting case. Hareini Nazir v'Nazir kishili ben. So we'll say now, watch this case. Guy says, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain says, I am a Nazir. Statement one. Statement one. And I will be a Nazir when I have a son. So we'll say, in this case, what he's undertaking are 2 periods of Nazirus. 2 periods of Nazirus. Right? So we'll say, see what's happening over here? I'm a Nazir. That's statement one. By the way, unqualified Neder Nazirus extends for how long? 30 days. So I'm a Nazir. That's statement one. And I will be a Nazir when I have a son. Okay. So therefore, what happens? What happens? What does he do? He starts counting his Neder Nazirus. Right? So what happens over here is he starts counting his Neder Nazirus. Then what happens? His chelbona shelo v'achar nolad lo ben. And what happens while he's in the middle of his neder nazirus? Well, so let's play this out, right? So what happens now? So it is the 14th of Shvat, and then what happens? He goes ahead and he says, "Hareini Nazir, I'm a Nazir, and I'm also going to be a Nazir when I have a son, right? When I have a son." What happens? So 14th of Shvat, he begins his neder nazirus. They will say, then what happens? 10 days later, on the 24th of Shvat, Mazel Tov, he has a son. So what happens now? So the Mishnah says, so we'll say, so now, what's the problem? What's the problem? He's in the middle of one neder nazirus, but now the other has just been activated with the birth of his son. So what do you do? So the Gemara says, Mashlim es shalo, the achar kach mona es shalbeno. Not a problem. Finish off the remaining 20 days that you have on your current neder nazirus, and then after you're finished with your neder nazirus, then go with your first neder nazirus, then count the neder nazirus for the birth of your son. Beautiful. Fine. So the Gemara says, what about the following case? So the Gemara says, fine. So what about Harini Nazir Kishili Ben? So we'll say that's case number one. Case number two is the same case, just you've reversed the order. Namely what? Hareini Nazir Kishili Ben. I'm going to be a Nazir when I have a son. So I'm a Nazir when I have a son. So the Gemara says, Nazir. So we'll say in this case, same case, I'm taking upon myself 2 periods of Naziris, but what? I flipped the order. So the first Nazir I made is when I have a son, I'm going to be a Nazir, right? And then also I'm going to be a Nazir, except in the Naziris. Now we'll say, now what happens? I'm a guy who likes to get things, Reuven's a guy who likes to get things done. So he realizes his wife is due, but she hasn't given birth yet. So what does he decide to do? He decides to start the second period of Nazirus first. In other words, why not? Chabrai, might as well get started. His chilmona es shalo, he begins to count his neder Nazirus, the achar kach nolad lo ben, and then Abba say, then his son, Mazel Tov, his son was born. So we'll say, same case. 14th of Shvat, he says, when I have a son, I'm going to become a Nazir. And I'm also counting another independent neder Nazirus. So we'll say he decides at the 14th of Shvat, I might as well start my own neder Nazirus now. So he begins, and then what happens? On the 24th of Shvat, 10 days later, Baruch Hashem, Mazel Tov, his wife gives birth. So we'll say, what's the halacha in this case? Maniach es shalo. I will say in this case, he stops his personal Nazirus, right? And what? I'm sorry. Excuse me. He stops his neder nazirus, right? Umona es shel beno. He counts the neder nazirus for his son. The achar kach mashlim es shalo. So we'll say, let me tell you this outside. So in case number 2, what happens over here is as follows. So we'll say, so again, just right. Let's go through the 2 cases now. Case number 1, Reuven says, I'm a Nazir, already Nazir. Statement 1. Statement 2, I'm also going to be a Nazir when I have a son. Okay? What happens? It's the 14th of Shvat. We'll say, what does Reuven do? He begins to count his neder nazirus. Then Mazel Tov, 24th of Shvat, 10 days later, his wife has a son. What's the halacha? Finish off your current neder nazirus, and then observe the neder nazirus for the birth of your son. Case 1. Case 2, Reuven says, I'm going to be a Nazir when my wife has a son. Statement one. Statement two, I'm taking upon myself an additional Neder Nazirus. Okay, what does he do? 14th of Shvat, he begins to observe his personal Neder Nazirus. Then again, Mazel Tov, 24th of Shvat, 10 days in, his wife goes and gives birth to a boy. We'll say, what's the halacha in that case? He pauses his personal Neder Nazirus, pauses it, observes the 30 days Nazirus for his son, and then when he finishes that, observes the 20 remaining days for his initial Neder Nazirus. Okay, so fascinating. Now, both say, at first glance, why the distinction between the two cases? Why the distinction? The order. In case number one, you took upon yourself first your personal Neder Nazirus, and then the Neder Nazirus for your son. So therefore, again, when you started your first Neder Nazirus, it makes sense. That's what you took upon yourself first. In case number two, you took upon the Neder Nazirus for your son first, and then your personal Neder Nazirus later on. That seems to be what's driving this. I want to draw your attention to the Rush for just a moment. The Rush, I will say, is on the right-hand side. About 2, 4, 6, 8, about 12 lines in. The Rush says, "V'achakach nolad lo ben, kodim sheshamu, maniach es shalo umone shal beno. Dechivan shekibel nazirus beno tchila miyad, kishenolad lo ben." I will say, in this case over here, remember, this is case number 2 in the Mishnah, Reuven accepted the nazirus for his son first. Therefore, miyad kishenolad lo ben tzarich lahaniach es shalo, v'limnos es shal beno. So I will say, the Rush confirms this, that this is all about the order in which you are taking upon yourself these nidarim. In case number 2, you took the neder nazirus for your son on before the neder nazirus for yourself. Therefore, again, when your son is born, you pause your personal neder nazirus, you observe the nazirus for your son. V'limnos es shal beno, v'yachar kach yashlim es shalo. V'nafkamina b'afsakazu, she'eno megaleach kiyem pam achos. So we'll say, now what we're going to see, where this becomes very interesting, Rabbi say, is how many haircuts and neder naziroses are you bringing in these cases? See, I will say, if you notice in case 1 of the Mishnah, what's happening over here? In case 1 of the Mishnah, you're finishing off your neder nazirus, and then you're beginning a separate neder nazirus. So Rabbi say, what that sounds like is 2 independent nidrei nazirus, which may come with 2 haircuts, right, and 2 sacrificial obligations. In case number 2, it sounds strange, like it's almost like one fluid period with interruptions, right? You have 10 days, pause, 30 days for the birth of your son, and then the remaining 20 days. So that sounds like it's one fluid time with 1 haircut at the end and 1 order of karbanos at the end. So we'll say that we're going to have to see. Let's take a quick look at the Gemara. Says the Gemara, by Rava. Rava asks as follows: Amar hareini nazir la'achar esrim yom ume'achshav mea yom. Let's listen to this interesting case. Reuven says, I'm a nazir after 20 days. So we'll say in this case over here, what Reuven is doing, right? Neder number 1 is he's saying in 20 days I'm going to become a nazir. We'll say, now why would a guy say in 20 days I'm going to become a nazir? He obviously has a lot planned for the next 20 days, right? So whatever is about, so he already knows. Let's say, sometimes you're going to do something that you're going to have to apologize for later on. So that kind of sounds like what's about to unfold over here, right? Whatever's going to be happening in the next 20 days is going to be Labor Day, right? So in 20 days from now, I'm going to become a Nazir. Fine. Now I'll say, in this case, here's what's interesting. See, in 20 days from now, I am going to trigger an Neder Nazirus. And from now, I'm taking on 100-day Nazirus. So I will say, so the shaila is, what happens in a case like this? So I will say, see here. So look, first of all, look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Bai Rava Harini Nazir, Kilomar, Havadai Pshitali, Shemamar Harini Nazir, La'achar Lamed Yom, Ume Achshav Nazir Stam, Kevan de Benazir Zushet, the Shamar me Achshav Yakal Hashlim, Kodim Shiascha also Nazirus, Shamar Lachar Lamed Yom, the Ha Amar Nazir. I'm supposed to listen to this. It goes without saying, if a person says, I'm going to become a Nazir 30 days from now, and I'm also taking on another Neder Nazirus now. So we'll say, that's fine. Why is that fine? Because you have 2 separate periods of 30 days each, and you could fulfill the first or the second even before the first starts. The complicated case comes in this situation about, I say in 30 days, or excuse me, in 20 days, I'm going to become a Nazir, and I'm taking upon myself now a neder Nazirus for 100 days. So what do you do with this? Look at Rashi again. Kevan dalin kuf be'ezron lo shleim. And someone said, now listen to this. I'm sorry, before I get to Rashi. So let's analyze the question. Kevan dalin mea be'ezron lo shalmin lo chaylin. So we'll say, do we say that obviously, since you can't observe the 100 days within 20 days, therefore the 100-day neder nazirus is not chal now. We'll say, when will it be chal? When will it be chal? Essentially, when? 50 days from now. Right? That's the 20 until you get to your neder nazirus. The 30 days you have your neder nazirus, and then afterwards your 100-day nazirus will be chal. O dilma, or do we say, this is actually very interesting, kevan de isle gidol ser lesof chaylin. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Maybe we should say like this. Maybe let him start the 100-day nazirus now. Let him start it now. Rabbi say, actually, take a look at Rashi. O Dilma, see Rashi. O Dilma, it's about 10 lines up from the bottom. O Dilma, Kevan, Dilu maschil mimne nazirus kof me'achshav akanti miyasrei lehu kedei gidol seir tapashlu tamni dislu begidol seir tuva vilchach maschil me'achshav umone chaf yom v'achar kach mona lami. So say, maybe here's the second possibility. What's the second possibility? Start the 100-day nazirus now. Start it now. And what do you do now? Observe 20 days of the first neder nazirus now. Then what, Rabbi say? Then what? Pause. Pause for what? The second neder nazirus for 30 days. And then after those 30 days over, what do you do? The remaining 80. And there's enough left over on the back end, the 80 days, to constitute a significant amount of nazirus. So Rabbi say, you hear the shaila? Rabbi say, I want to point out to you, this would have never even been a havamina of a shaila had we not learned the Mishnah. Because remember again, what is the Mishnah introducing me to? The Mishnah is introducing me to this idea that I could pause an existing neder nazirus to make room for another one and then pick it up on the back end. Because remember again, this was case number 2 in the Mishnah. Case number 2 in the Mishnah is, I say, upon the birth of my son, I'm going to be a Nazir, and I'm also accepting upon myself a neder nazirus now. I begin my own personal neder nazirus now, and then what happens? 10 days later, my wife gives birth. So what's the halacha? We pause. I've observed 10 days. Pause. Observe the 30 days triggered by the birth of my son. And then after those 30 days, what? Finish up everything afterwards. So Rabbi say, now that we've introduced that, so now watch this. I say, I'm going to become a Nazir in 20 days, but I'm also taking upon myself a neder nazirus for 100 days. So do we say, possibility 1 is, okay, the 100-day nazirus is going to have to wait until you fulfill the other one, because obviously, Rabbi say, no matter how hard you try in life, you can't squeeze 100 days into 20. Rabbi say, by the way, it's an incredible musar. That sometimes a person has to be realistic about what they can accomplish in the amount of time that they have. Nothing is more frustrating than trying to cram an enormous amount of accomplishment into a small amount of time. In other words, essentially, that's what we do in life in general, but it has to be somewhat realistic. You can't squeeze 20 days, 100 days into 20. Or second possibility is what? Second possibility is, no, begin to observe the 100 days, right? Observe the 100 days, right? Observe the first 20, then observe your neder nazirus, then what? Continue the back end 80. And it's okay because the back end 80 are substantive enough. Literally, the Gemara says there's enough hair growth in 80 days that it'll be a substantive neder nazirus. To which the Gemara says, "V'tibayli nazirus mu'ates." The Gemara says, by the way, you don't just have to ask this in a case ultimately again of 100 days. You could even ask this in a case ultimately again in a case of 30 days. Or as we're say, let's say a person says, I'm going to be a Nazir in 20 days from now, and then what? And then I'm going to go ahead, right, in 20 days, and then I accept upon myself another neder nazirus now. So that's the shaila. Do I have to wait until 50 days from now to begin my neder nazirus, or can I what? Can I go ahead and say, you know what, I'll observe 20 days now, and then after the second neder nazirus, then what? Observe the remaining 10. To which the Gemara says, you're right. To which the Gemara says, Chada migo chada kami boile. The truth is, the Gemara is asking both of those questions. So I will say, we're going to stop over here for today. We're going to do a little Mesilas Yesharim. We'll stop over here for today with this. I'm leaving you kind of mid-question, but Amirat Hashem will resolve this question. Amirat Hashem, I will say, incredible. Let's do a few minutes of Mesilas Yesharim. Shabbos say we are continuing Meretz Hashem in Perek Chaf Beis, the Midas Ha'anava. Midas Ha'anava. Shabbos say a really beautiful statement of the Ramchal. Shabbos say the Ramchal is talking about this idea that a person really cannot become a Baal Gaiva, cannot become arrogant, and must remain humble, even with all of their gifts. Why? Because the gifts, the ability, the kohos that we have are given to us in a custodial capacity, with which right to do good for the other. Therefore, the Ramchal says, Al Kain, Eino ela lahodos l'mishechanano v'likana tamid yoser. Therefore, the Ramchal writes, a person has to give perpetual thanks and ultimately to be humbled by the gifts they have in life. To what can this be compared? La'ani ve'evion shemekabel matana b'chesed sheyefsha shelo sheyavish. This can be compared to a pauper. Right? A pauper gets a gift from someone who is wealthy. Shabbos say, does the pauper become arrogant? Of course not, right? The pauper is humbled. The pauper is humbled. And the more the pauper gets, the more humbled he becomes by the enormous display of generosity by his benefactor. Shabbos says, listen to this. Therefore, the Ramchal says, that's what life is with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shabbos says, whatever I have in life is a gift from Hashem. I am the ani. I am the pauper. Shabbos says, a pauper is totally reliant on others. I am absolutely, wholly, fully, and totally reliant on the Ribono Shel Olam. I am reliant. And therefore, again, when I have beautiful gifts in life, I have to feel like that pauper who is fundamentally humbled by the generosity of his benefactor. What he calls this Mashiv La Hashem, right? What could I possibly say to Hashem? Kol sagmelohi alai. Ultimately, again, I will say, what could I do for, because all of the good, Kol sagmelohi means all that Hashem has bestowed upon me. What could I say? What words do I have to even express my gratitude for all that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has bestowed upon me? The Ukvara inu Chasidim Gidolin Shenen Shal Sheikh Ziku Tov Liatzman Im Kol Chasidusam. I will say we see examples, unfortunately, of great people who thought that their gifts and their accomplishments were their own, and therefore, again, despite their incredible piety, were punished, were held accountable. Ultimately, again, because they did not understand the nature of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was their benefactor. Nehemia ben Chachalya Amru Zichron Livracha Mipnei Ma Lo Nikra Sifra Shemo B'Mnei Sheikh Siktol Yatzma. It's very interesting. In the original order of Tanakh, there's not a Sefer Nehemia. And I will say it's interesting because the way we currently have Tanakh arranged, Nehemia was broken out as its own Sefer. But in fact, Sefer Nehemia is part of Ezra. So the Ramchal says, why is it, according to Maris Sanhedrin, why didn't Nehemiah go ahead and get his own Sefer? Why is he part of Sefer Ezra? Ultimately, again, because I will say he looked at his accomplishments as his own. Now, obviously, I just want to point out, we're talking about great men, great tzaddikim. But I will say, what the Ramchal is pointing out is that even great tzaddikim could sometimes make the mistake of thinking that their accomplishments are their own. Ultimately, and therefore they're held accountable for that as well. He goes on, he says, V'chein Chizkiya, King Chizkiya, hu v'ganosia la'ira azos l'mani l'man David Avdi, o kima amaron zichron l'vracha, kol hatola b'schus atzmo, which literally means when a person thinks that he has earned something for his own credit, right? I've earned this because of my own accomplishment, because of my own piety. HaKadosh Baruch Hu reminds him that what you have in life is not because of you. What you have in life is because of the benefit or the schuyos of others. She'ein la'adam afilu lahachzik tov li'atzma tavosav v'choshekin shelo yisnase v'yigba b'hem. What do you see from here? What do you see? It's really an incredible thing. What do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, when you have something in life, Rabbi, never make the mistake of thinking that what you have is because of things you did, or that what you have is somehow because you earned it. A person has to go through life recognizing everything I have is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I will say, so therefore, if I live life through that, if I live life with that mindset, what does that engender? It engenders constant and consistent humility. I will say also, I'll point out something else. See, there's a danger with living life thinking that you've earned things. Because if you live life and you think that you've earned something, it creates a mindset of magiali, that things are owed to me. I will say the worst thing in life is to live life that anything's owed to you. If you live life with the mantra of nothing is owed to me, and I will say even more, no one owes me anything. No one owes me anything. If you live your life there, I will say, you know what, something amazing happens, which is every single time someone does something for you, it's like, wow. It's like the jackpot. As opposed to, I will say, some people walk through life with a magiali attitude, an entitled attitude. They're angry at everyone, right? Why are they angry at everyone? No one's coming through. No one's doing what they're supposed to. This one should have done this. I'm angry at my wife. I'm angry at my kids. I'm angry at my parents. I'm angry at my friends. I'm angry at everyone because no one's. Why? Because you feel entitled. You feel entitled. That's what I'm describing over here. But if you live life with zero entitlement, then again, everything that happens from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I feel no entitlement from God, and I feel no entitlement to anything from anyone around me. Then suddenly everything I get and everything I possess is such a beautiful gift that is given to me. It's incredible. Va'amnam, kol ze mimashu roi lahashiv alibo, mi sheyeh ke'Avram, ke'Moshe, ke'Aaron, ke'David, u'shar chasidim shezacharnu. So I'll say, so again, the Ramchal just points out, this was the midah of our great leaders. Avram, Moshe, Aaron, David, they lived life with zero entitlement. Zero entitlement. So because they lived life with zero entitlement, they recognized that every single beautiful thing they had was a gift, was a matana from the Ribono Shel Olam. Aval anachnu yisomi yisomim. Eino notzrichem l'chol zeh, ki kvar yesh v'yesh itanu chesronos. Rabos, she'ein tzarech iyun gadol liros pechisusenu. Shabbos say, so the truth is we're so far off from the levels of our great leaders of yesteryear. But I will say one thing I do know. You know what tells me why I'm not entitled? Because I recognize all of my faults, or at least I try to recognize all of my faults and all of my shortcomings. And when I realize that the truth is I don't measure up to even the person I'm capable of becoming, I recognize that I'm entitled in reality to very little. He says, V'chol chachmosinu ka'inech shavas, ki hayoser chacham gadol shebeinenu, einum kim min tamidi ha-tamidim asher kidoros harishonim. V'zeh ma sheroi shenaven v'neida be'emes, v'lo yazuach aleinu libenu chinam, ele nakir shedatenu kala, v'sichlenu chalosh ad ma'od. So we'll say now he's transitioning a little bit. Ramchal is transitioning to focusing on what else engenders humility. What else is realize what you are, but also realize what you're not. And when I realize the greatness of previous generations and how I don't measure up to that, that also engenders a sense of humility. Again, I want to point out, Ramchal is not telling me to feel bad about myself. Ramchal is just trying to get me to be real about myself. Hasichlos Rabbanu v'atos koveres v'asher neida oso eina ele ma'at min ha'ma'at. Im kein vadai she'ein ron lanu ha'inase klal el aboshes v'ashiflos v'zeh pashut. So we'll stop over here for today, but I'm just pointing out that what Ramchal is really highlighting is this incredible. He says, so we'll say, so two pieces. Piece number one, which is incredibly profound, don't live life with a sense of entitlement. Don't live life with magiali. If you live life feeling no one owes you anything, even HaKadosh Baruch Hu owes me nothing, then we'll say, what does that do? First of all, it's such a great way to live life, because then everything that you get is so exciting. And everything you receive, it's like the jackpot. And I will say, what else does it do? It engenders a sense of humility. That's number one. Number two, the Ramchal says, be ever aware of your deficiencies, of your faults, and of your shortcomings. Not in order to beat yourself up, but Lamaisa, to be fully cognizant of who you are, of what you are. And I will say that also engenders within us a profound sense of humility. I will say, Shkoyach, we'll stop over here to be continued tomorrow. All right, Chavron Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. A good Shabbos. A wonderful, getting ready for Shabbos already. Have a wonderful day, everyone.